going to be Git flow for daily use. You didn't know what you're coming in here for. Possibly on its farewell tour for this presentation. Some of you have probably seen it numerous times before, so think you have new ideas for next year's seasons. But we'll go through it again today, and hopefully I'll get something out of it here. I'm Kevin Vassarab. I'm a senior Drupal developer with MediaCurrent, and kind of my background is coming from the media industry, doing newspapers, media sites, things of that nature, and also working with a lot of the workflow things at MediaCurrent, helping us evolve some of our processes for using Git and Git flow and standardizing how our development works through workflows and things like that. You can get me at MediaCurrent, at @kvassarab on Twitter. Also use the hashtag DCATL, and tell me what you think about the presentation, and we'll go from there. I'll check up on you after the presentation ends and see what kind of nasty things or funny things or making fun of me things you do on there today. We'll go from there. So today's Git flow for daily use presentation, we've got a couple of prerequisites as we go through this today. One is you should probably have already taken the Git 101 class at some point. What we're going to go through today is a little bit more advanced usage of Git. It's something that doesn't really change how Git works, but it's workflows for Git. So you should have a basic understanding of Git. If you don't understand some of the branching and more advanced topics of Git, we're going to go over some of that while we go through this. But this will give you a brief understanding of how you're using this Git flow process within daily use and how you're doing that. Also, although it's not 100% necessary, you're probably going to want to be using a multi-site environment with Git flow. You can do it on your own local, you can do it on your production instance or whatnot, but you're not going to get the main benefits out of it without having a typical, probably 3-site setup like a development, staging, production environment, things of that nature. In addition, you should be comfortable on the command line. There are some GUI tools out there that do Git flow and do some Git commands and things like that. I prefer to stay away from them because a lot of times the terminology that they use and things that they're talking about on those GUI tools is a little bit different than what Git flow on the command line is actually using. And then when you go to Google, a question you might have, they're referencing command line, it's just differences, and you'll just be a little more standardized between command line versus the GUIs and things of that nature. Yeah, source tree would be that GUI, one of the ones that I know changes some of the naming and things like that in it, so I try to avoid it and just stick with the command line. So today we're going to go all through command line. Also today, this is going to I've got a lot of stuff to cram into this one, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through some of it and try and save some time for questions at the end also. It's also going to get pretty technical as well. A lot of sessions you'll see, we're going to go overview. We're going to actually go through exactly what commands you're going to run, how to do it, things of that nature. So some benefits of why would you want to be using this Git flow? What's its point? What's its problem? What are you going to get from it? One of those things is parallel development. Git flow makes it very easy to work on one, we'll call it feature of the site, and then quickly switch gears to another. And this is different than a features module that you're used to hearing about in Drupal or things like that. You're basically working on an individual piece of the project, and Git flow helps you to abstract that away from other pieces of the project. So you work on things in parallel. In addition, that parallel development allows you then to have better collaboration as well with your team. This is really great, especially in distributed teams, larger development teams, and things of that nature, because you're able to have that abstracted level. So people are working on different sets of code at the same time. It can even be in the same file, but you're not getting run into if one of your developers has committed a parse error somewhere into their code branch. You've rebased down, got in that code, and now you're trying to figure out what's going on, what broke, how did my code break? You're keeping your individual pieces of the project abstracted, and you're just worrying about what you're working on yourself. In addition, you can push this up and get other developers help on it as well, and use the benefits of Git for that. Another great benefit of it is release staging, and all these we're going to get into a little bit more as we keep going through the presentation today. Release staging is similar to once features are complete, you have one central location for those final changes. At any time, then this is something that you can then roll into your production environment, and you have a great integration point to know exactly where things are and knowing what things are breaking, where things might be happening at that point. And finally, you get support for emergency fixes. This is a really great benefit that I didn't really realize until we started using Git flow in those types of situations where a lot of times if you're coming from another version control system or even Git in general without using some of the branching and merging strategies in Git, you get stuck in the situation where you've rolled out a release to a site, you started doing a whole bunch of development work on other parts of the site, and lots of new features, a lot of those aren't ready to roll out to production, and then your boss comes along and says, hey, there's this one thing that needs to be done right now today on the site. and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I've got all this other code now, I can't roll this out to production yet, what am I going to do? GitFlow has a great system for making you be able to do that and not have to worry about rolling out all that new development code onto the site. So what is GitFlow then? We know the benefits, we know some of the prereqs and things like that. For looking at this, what are we using GitFlow for? What actually is it? Well, at the core, it's just a branching and merging strategy. GitFlow doesn't have any new functionality at all to Git. What you're seeing in GitFlow is strictly what you can think of as macros in a word processing system or things like that. It's basically taking things that Git already does, combining them into its own script, and using naming conventions so it knows exactly what you're doing at those points. One could easily replicate the functionality of this within other version control systems or even without GitFlow itself. But the reasoning and the reason why you want to do this is why would you want to do all this? Instead of having 5 commands you have to type individually, you can run 1 command, GitFlow takes care of it all for you and keeps it standardized in that instance. So the reason why GitFlow works this way, I must have jumped ahead there on the slide a bit. Git branches are cheap and merges are easy. There's a joke in there if you want to go for it, but Git branches are really cheap and easy, and you have this ability to do constant branching and merging between things because of that strategy. Where this comes from is that in other systems, each branch is a complete replication of the code base. The example I like to use all the time of this is Subversion. It's a total replication of the code base whenever you do a branch or a tag, and that makes a really difficult process for when you want to create a new branch. You have to do that duplication. You're taking up a lot of storage space and things of that nature. In Git, a branch is simply a pointer to a different commit point in time. So you're not changing the actual code too much, you just do it small pieces, and you can quickly and easily switch branches around. A good example of the differences you can see within Git is the system of how large the repositories are between Git and Subversion. We did a conversion recently, a couple months ago now, of a site that was in SVN, had been in SVN for a couple of years now, and its Subversion repository is 1.5 gigs of space to take up. Does anyone in here have any guesses to how, and if you've seen the presentation, you're not allowed to give the answer, how much space it was actually to when we converted it over to Git? 500 megs, you're still too high. 50 megs, we're coming in the middle there. 200 megs we got it down to. So if you think about that, 1.5 gigs down to 200 megs, how much time is saving now when you've got a new developer coming on, you've got to clone that repo down, and you've got to do different things on it, you're pushing things up and deploying it to servers. You've just taken so much bandwidth out of the equation at this point. It's a great help. So as I said, you should know some Git 101, but since branching and merging are such a core strategy of the GitFlow process, we're going to go over some branching 101 and some merging 101 in core Git, just so you know some of the basics of what that is and what it's doing. So the first command we're going to look at, and this is going to be really tiny. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this projector was much different size than I was expecting. If you want, the slides for this presentation are on the Drupal Camp Atlanta session page for this session already, so you can follow along through SlideShare on there if you need a better look at some of the slides and you can't read it there. Git branch -a, that's going to be a command that's going to show you all the branches on the site. And where's the rest of the pieces there? Nice. There it is. So this is going to show all the different pieces of branching within the site. So in this case, when we ran git branch -a, it's going to show you develop and a master branch, as well as your remote branches, such as remotes origin master and remotes origin develop. Those are your individual pieces that's over on the master site and master location there. Git checkout -b. This is another command that's going to let you create a new branch from wherever you're on at this point. So basically, if you're on a develop branch within Git, and you want to create a new branch called new_branch, you just do git checkout -b new_branch, and it's going to automatically create a new branch and switch you to that branch as your working copy at that point. And then when you do that, you'll see at this point we have git branch. Our asterisks at the top show that we were on the develop branch, and the laser doesn't work on here, so we'll stay without it. New branch now is the asterisk next to it that shows that we've actually switched over to that branch at this point. and then git branch test underscore 2 if you did something of that nature. This is a good way of running yourself quick little backups or things like that in Git. It basically is going to create a new branch from where you're looking at, but keep you on the original branch. So if you run git branch test underscore 2, you're still going to be on new branch, but another branch has been created for you at that point. And over on the left, or your right side of it, it's kind of a fork of how you would see it coming down. You have your develop branch, you branch off to a new branch at that point, and then merging will bring those pieces together at the bottom again, and bring new branch back into develop. So merging 101, this is simply running the git merge command. There's not much more to it than that. So one of the tricks you want to do for that is you want to be on the branch that you want to merge into. So in this case, this is some of the git 101 stuff here. You want to do git checkout develop, and this would bring you over to your develop branch. At that point, all you have to do is run a git merge and the branch name you want to bring in. So if you remember, we had the 2 lines on the last slide. New branch, we checked out develop again, now we're going to bring new branch back into develop at that point. All your merges will be merged into it, and while the merge does what it does is apply each commit you made to that new branch on top of the develop branch and where it was. It just takes all those individual patch files that Git works off of and applies those individually at that point. Git is really, really good at resolving its own conflicts in terms of the conflict resolution and things like that. And what I mean by conflict resolution is, say, develop has been here, some other developer made changes to the same line of code that you made changes to. Git's really good at figuring those out a lot of times, but occasionally you will get into conflicts, and we could do an entire session presentation on how to resolve conflict resolution, so we're not going to go into that too much today. But there are great resources out online for that, and we can talk afterwards if you want to hear more about some conflict resolution things. So some terminology to get you into what terminology you need to know in regards to using Git flow. One is your branches. You have your master branch. This is going to be your production site code base. When you're using Git in general, all of your code is on the master branch by default. In Git flow, only your production code base is on the master branch, and no code should ever be directly committed to this branch. If you're on the master branch and you try to run a Git commit, you're doing it wrong. You shouldn't be ever touching Git. You shouldn't ever be committing code directly onto this master branch. Git flow takes care of that for you. The develop branch, this is where all the code that's ready for production on a staging environment is put at for an integration point. Basically, if something is on the develop branch, it should be stable enough that if your release manager decides at that point that we want to roll code out to production, you're not going to break anything at that point. If something's in develop that's going to break something else if it rolls out to production, then it should not be in the develop branch at that point. At that point, your code should still be what's called a feature branch. And a feature branch, this is where all of your active code work is going to be done. Usually this is going to relate to a specific task or a ticket or something of nature like that. And what this is helping you to do is you're keeping feature branches separated out so there's a logical delineation of where your code changes are happening. So this ticket that you're working on has XYZ that needs to be added to the site. Well, all those changes and those changes only are in this feature branch. If there's changes to another part of the code base for something else, you're doing that in a separate feature branch, and then all those are going to come together at the end. And we'll get into exactly how you're going to do that in a little bit. Once you're ready to release a site, you've got a release branch. And what this is a temporary integration branch. And what that does is take your develop branch, pushes that out, and lets you have this ability to do any hotfixes or changes that you might need to do while you're doing release testing. So things roll out to the site, you found that somebody left a parse error in the develop branch. You need to fix that real quick before you go on the site. Rather than restart the whole process, you have this one temporary integration branch that you can make that change to, commit to that release branch, and when things finish up, everything cleans up itself, and we'll get into exactly what it cleans up and how it does a little bit later as well. Finally, the concept of hotfixes. This is what we were talking about at the very beginning, of emergency fixes for the production site. These are things that you've made changes to develop, or you've got things you don't want to roll out to production yet that are somehow in there, say, new features for the site, but something crazy is happening to make a rollout of changes. What it's doing is actually taking off, and it's going to go off of your production site base instead of your develop base to make those emergency fixes, and the workflow will support that for you. So one of the most famous things, if you've ever Googled Git flow, is you're going to see this giant diagram at some point very quickly when you start researching Git flow. It is very confusing to look at, especially when you can't read half of it, because I had to squeeze it down to fit it onto the slide. What we're doing though is each colored column within this is representing an individual branch of the process. And rather than reading left to right like you normally would, we're going to read right to left from the top right corner, and that's your original master branch at that point. And we're going to break this down and show you how to understand this chart in an individual basis. So when we start out working with Git flow, that top right is going to be your master branch of where everything starts out. This is where you start out if you've never done Git flow before. All your code has already been on here. You're running that on production and things of that nature. What we're doing is we're going to roll out master to develop when we start Git flow. This creates a new branch for develop, and this is going to be where all of our work starts happening at that point. As we move down and keep going across to the left, there's some commits that have happened on develop, and then bigger commits are happening over on an individual feature branches as well. All those feature branches can be developed in parallel with each other and merged back together in the end. If we start adding more of those columns back into place, this green column we just added in is actually a release branch. So this is where we take that time, we take develop, we're going to get it ready to move to production, we're going to do some testing out on an integration server or a staging server. We've noticed a couple of changes that need to happen, and that's where the extra green dots come in as we go down the line. And on that release branch, when we get done with it and roll it out to production, those changes are not only going to roll to production, they're also going to roll back into your develop branch so that you don't have any reversions or any problems down the road. And then finally, the last piece you're going to add into this is the thought of hotfixes. So where release branches would merge all the way over to master, and when we started out at master, we started at the top and moved over to develop. And when we started a release, or a feature branch rather, with the pink code, you saw that it started from the yellow develop branch and then merged itself out to the pink where it was. Well, a hotfix has a little bit differentiation because instead of starting from develop, it's going to start from your last commit on master. So you see the line comes down to the red purplish hotfix there, and then it's going to roll back out to master when you finish it, but it's also going to roll back down to develop as well. And this will keep you from having any problems. So that hotfix that you rolled out to the site, next time you run a release, you didn't lose that change. Because that's something nobody wants to do at that point, because someone's going to get yelled at when a change that was working now is reverted back. So that's a whole bunch of different information there on just the brief overview of how Git flow is working, and all of you right now are glazed over, wait a minute, this is way too much, how am I going to do this? Well, you'll start to see a couple little trends in how each of these pieces work. And what we're going to do next is actually go through a little bit of a scenario in terms of that daily use. So why would I use this in daily use? We'll talk to a real world scenario and how we're going to use it from this point on. So our real world scenario is that we want to start using Git flow on a repo initially. We have a request to make a change to the site of something that we want to do based on an individual ticket. We've started the request, but now we want some code review or some different type of help from another developer regarding the functionality. We're going to release that into production. At that point, we're going to realize that we screwed something up, and we need to make a fix to production at some point, and then see from there how everything comes together at that point. So to initially set up Git flow, you're going to need to install Git flow on the operating system of your choice and ensure it's in your path directory so you have access to it from anywhere on the command line. Since so many different operating systems work in different ways, we're not going to go over the actual installation, but there's some links that you can quickly Google to see the different installation instructions for Mac OS, Linux, and heaven forbid if you're actually still using Windows, then you can still do it, but I don't recommend it. Just in general. Use yourself a virtual machine or something if you have to at that point. So to start looking at it, we've got a perfectly good branch here. This is a Git repo that someone's already been using for a while. We want to start using Git flow on it. If we run git status, we see we're on branch master. There's nothing to commit there. We're just going to run git flow init. And one note to make just about this presentation is how I have mine set up is git flow in my path is set up as git -flow. By default, things will set up as git space flow. You might have it set up as git with no space flow. Whatever that word is that you've got yours set up for is what you're going to want to use in that place. In my situation, I'm using a git hyphen. Up to you, however you have yours set up is what you're going to want to do for that. So we're going to do a git flow init, and at this point, it's going to walk you through a couple different questions of what you want to do. One is which branch should be used for bringing forth the production releases, and normally what I always recommend on all these questions is just accepting the defaults. There is a flag that you can add to the GitFlow init to accept all those defaults for you. For the purpose of the presentation, I'd like to just show it so you're aware of these questions and what they're asking you about. We're going to say that we're using master for our production release. We're going to use develop for features, which is our next release, or for our development for our next release side. And then what feature branches, release branches, hotfixes, and all those are going off of. And basically what the concept is here is like I was saying earlier, is that GitFlow doesn't do anything to your repo. You can initialize it on anything, or you can do all this on your own. These naming conventions it gives, a feature slash, release slash, a hotfix slash, those types of things, that's something that's basing off, and GitFlow is looking for those different branch naming conventions, and that's how it's able to work this out without adding anything to your repo or anything different. So we usually accept the default values, and then we want to create the feature at that point as our first thing. We have some code we want to do, we have some changes we need to make, we're going to create our feature. So to do that, we're going to see git branch, we have our develop and our master branch there, we're on our develop branch already. If not, you probably want to use git checkout develop and just make sure you've got it all there. And we're going to do git flow feature start, and then a name for that feature. So in this instance, you'll see that feature name I have is 1234-78900-add feature. It's a really long name. You probably don't want to use that long of a naming system. The reason why I put that in there, though, is you want to probably standardize your feature names, just as a good best practice there. One of the things that we do at MediaCurrent and other companies have gone to as well is using a ticket number, hyphen a comment number if it applies, hyphen a short description. And usually I use 1 or 2 words only for that description, because you're going to have to type this a couple times. So you probably want to have some sort of git auto-completion script or something on your command line so you don't have to type as much at that point. Or if you do, you've got shorter names to worry about it. The reason why I like using this standard is that a feature should be tied to a ticket in your normal workflow. So in this case, when you go back to your git log and look and see what's going on or what's happened in there, you see this feature branch with this number in it. You can quickly reference the original ticket and what the reason was for this and what kind of code was happening at that point. So what happens when you actually run that code is GitFlow is going to give you a summary of everything it did. So to talk about GitFlow and how the individual pieces are, features are a very quick thing. And what it's done is it's created a new branch based on the develop branch. So what it's done for you in terms of regular git commands is said git checkout develop, git checkout -b, and then feature slash this name you've given it to make the feature branch happen. So it's done 2 commands for you and keeps you in that order. It'll also tell you what to do once you're finished with the feature at that point, which will be one of our next steps coming up. But a lot of times in our scenario that we talked about for our daily use, we want to push our code up so that another developer can work on it or give us a code review or something of that nature. So what you can do at that point is use git flow publish feature. And what this is going to do for you is you're going to use the feature name, the suffix that you gave for that feature, and do git flow publish and that name. What it's doing at that point is just saying, checks out that branch for you, does a git push to origin or whatever your alias is for your remote server, and pushes feature slash that feature name up to your origin. What that lets you do is now another developer can go, check out that feature from origin, make any changes they need to it, re-push it back up, let you take it back down, and make that collaborative environment that we talked about as one of the benefits originally. So when another user goes to another computer to do it, what they're going to do is run a git fetch and then git checkout feature slash the name there. And one of the delineations that you'll run into a couple times, especially when getting used to git flow at the beginning, is that any git flow command, so it starts with git flow, is going to use the branch name without the prefix to it. So without the feature slash or without the hotfix slash or whatever it might be, it's going to use just the feature name itself. If you're going back to a regular git command like here, where we're not using git flow, we need to use that entire longer name. So feature slash the name at that point. And that's why I said some of that auto-completion and things like that will come in handy for you as a helper script when doing that. I believe Git now comes with auto-completion by default, actually. So the developer on another computer will do a git checkout. If you made some other changes while they've had it, they're going to git fetch, they'll rebase their origin. And at some point, they're going to push that back up to origin, you'll bring it down, and you'll be able to finish your feature at that point. This is the point where all your code changes are done to it, you know it's in a stable position, If it wants to roll out, it can. So we're going to merge that back into develop. So we're going to do git flow feature finish, that feature name again, and we can then push that back to, then at that point it'll push back to develop for you. So as I was saying, it's the different macros. At this point, when we're doing a feature finish, what git flow is doing for you is it's saying, okay, I've got this branch. I'm going to go check out develop. I'm going to do a git merge feature slash that branch name. Once that merge completes, I'm going to do a git branch -d to delete your local branch. And then at that point, keep you on the develop branch. So it's done a couple different commands for you. One note, though, is that this will not delete a remote branch for you, though. So if you remember that git flow push to origin, well, we want to clean that up as a best practice once we're done doing features. So to do that, we're going to do git push origin :feature slash the name. What that's going to do is delete that branch from the remote repository. And that's just helping to clean up yourself, because every time you create one of these branches and push it forward, it's on the remote, it's not cleaning up after itself, so eventually you're going to have all these branches on your remote and have no idea whether they're done or what the status of them are. Luckily, if you're using a ticket naming convention, you can cross-reference that ticket and see exactly if that ticket's been completed. It's pretty safe to assume you can delete that branch. So our feature's created. We've got a bunch of features now that have been done, we'll say, and we're ready to go ahead and make a release at this point. So as I was saying, you're going to start seeing patterns going on in terms of how git flow works. We're going to do a git flow release start at this point. And that release start and feature start, that's that prefixing we talked about a little bit earlier to the branch names. So we're going to start a release, and normally in my workflow, what I like to do is use the date of the release with a .0 at the end. This can be whatever your versioning system is and whatever your standards are. Some use a V major release minor release or minimum release, wherever you want to go, 3 release pieces in there. However your standards are, that's what you can use in this instance. I like to use the dating just because the releases happen fairly infrequently on a lot of the projects we're working with, so it's a lot easier just to track by date, you know exactly when it went up and things of that nature. So what it's going to do when it creates a release is the same thing it did when it created a feature branch. It's literally just going to take develop, check out a new branch of that, but in this time it's going to be called release slash the name you've given it. And by doing that is we've now created that feature or that release, and it's the same as a feature was, but we're using a different workflow now. We know we're going to push this up to our origin by doing we're going to push this up to our origin, and we're going to test this out as an integration piece. Make any changes that happen to it, commits to it of that nature. And when we're done, we can use a git flow release finish at that point to finish it out. Here's where we're pushing up to origin at that point. You'll notice again, when we're pushing here, we're using a regular git command, so I use the prefix of release on it. So when we're ready to finish, we do git flow release finish. We use the name we gave it, and at that point, it's going to give you the summary again of everything that happened at that point. And for releases, those macros that it does is a little bit different than features. Is when a release finishes, it's going to take that release branch, it's going to check out master, it's going to merge that release branch into master, but then it's also going to delete the release branch, and next thing it's going to do is it's going to check out develop, and it's going to merge master back down into develop. So now all of your branches are at the same level, everything's got the same code within it at that point. At that point, you can also, again, clean up your work, clean up the release from the origin, so that way you have everything taken out of place on your remote server. The other thing that this will not do for you manually is when you finish the release, it's going to ask you to tag the release. So you're going to want to push that tag up at the end by doing git push -- tags, and that'll allow you to get the tag up to the remote server and save that point in time. And basically what a tag is, again, is just another marker point to show you everything that was set up on that piece at that time. So for a release, we want to make sure that's tagged, so at some point we can say, this release failed, there's all these other commits since the last release, but we're going to go back to this last point in time that we knew we had a stable release on production and roll ourselves back to that point. One of the great benefits of version control is by doing that. Hotfixes is the next piece of git flow terminology. This is where we screwed something up. We made a mistake and we need to fix it on production. So it's been a couple days, there's some things on develop that are new features that could roll out, but we want to wait for an actual release to do those, because maybe they're waiting for QA or they're waiting for something at that point. So we want to roll a hotfix, and what that's going to do is just do a git flow hotfix start, and what that does, instead of checking out from develop, it's going to check out from master, like I mentioned earlier. Check out from your production environment, lets you make those changes, but in this case, when we finish the hotfix, at that point, what we're going to do is actually what GitFlow is doing for you, rather than merging over to master, then merging master all the way back down to develop, we're going to do is we're going to merge that release two ways. We're going to merge it into master, we're going to also merge it into develop. So that way, that one little fix that you made is now in both locations, so when your next release rolls out, that fix that you made is now in that next release branch for you. I know that's a little bit confusing there. And again, same thing applies as we had earlier with the releases as well as hotfixes. Use kind of the same naming convention as you would a release. You would do a hotfix finish, you push all your different pieces up, push your origin to master, push your develop branch up, push your tags up, and those natures, and push it at that point. So we actually got through a bit earlier today. We got about 10 minutes left before next session comes in. We have a couple different resources I'd like to give you in terms of places to look for things. The first one up there is Andrew Riley's Introduction to Git. This is a quick introduction to different pieces of Git. The second one is that Nibby location. This is the original guide to GitFlow. This is the one where that big chart came that I showed you earlier. And the final one is another different resource on GitFlow that has a little bit simpler explanations than that original chart did at that point. So at that point, I'll go ahead and open it up to any questions you might have.
So what happens if there's a merge conflict in this multi-step process that GitFlow does? At what point does it stop? You're merging back into master, and then there's a merge conflict there, and you resolve it. Does it continue the rest of the process, or do you have to do it again?
Yeah, so the question was that what happens when there is an actual merge conflict during one of these release processes? So you're releasing out to master, and there's a merge conflict at that point, and you resolve that. Does it keep going on back and finish the process at that point? The answer is yes, it will. You'll fix that release, and because basically what it's doing is it's saying that it's still running through the same processes, and when you have that conflict, it's going to abort out, and you'll be able to fix that merge conflict and go from there, and keep the process moving.
I'm making an assumption, obviously, that your whole team has to have GitFlow, right?
No, doesn't have to be. It's a good assumption. I can see where it would come from. It works out better if everyone's using GitFlow, but one person could be using GitFlow, and if the rest of your team members aren't necessarily using it, if they know that they need to make changes on that feature branch, they can use the regular Git commands for doing that as well. But using the GitFlow commands is actually something that's going to help you to keep those workflows standardized and make sure someone doesn't forget one of those steps in the process. For instance, if you're creating that release or you're finishing a feature, if you forget to merge it into develop or you forget to merge a different direction from it, those can screw up a couple different things and get some problems down the road. So using it's a good thing, and also if someone has not been using it, they can initialize it right away and not cause any problems either, because it doesn't affect the repo at all. So if there's already branches checked out with feature slash or release slash or things like that, and another user comes in and checks out that release and then doesn't initialize also, it works just the same at that point. There's one in the back. So the question was, if you were a solo developer, would you use GitFlow? Was there more to it? Okay. Yeah, and that's a great question, actually, and it comes up a lot of times, especially in terms of Git as well as GitFlow. The question again was, if you're solo, would it be advantageous to use this process as well? And the answer is yes. It doesn't hurt anything to do it, and it gives yourself that mindset of making sure that you're keeping yourself in that same standard process each time, and you're not missing things as well. Just like I always say for people when I've done Git talks in general on that side is, you still, even if you're working by yourself, you're saying, oh, I'm not going to screw up, or I don't have to worry about other teammates and conflicts and things like that. Well, you still want to give yourself a backup, because at some point you're going to be coding along, you've screwed something up, and you forget where you need to go back or what you actually changed. In other instances as well is, if you have a situation where you don't have Git on a server to use to check out the code on a server, and you have to push up individual files, you can do nice diffs and things like that to see exactly what code you changed. And I use this all the time when working on a project, and I've done it on projects that don't use version control also. I'll initialize a Git repo locally, see what and while I make my changes, I can then do a git diff and see exactly what pieces I changed at that point. And it gives you a real good understanding before you make that commit to see what you changed. If there's something you left debug code in, if you've hit a bunch of files, you might forget about a file in a different directory you touched. And it just gives you that once-over and ability to see those different pieces.
On the local side, I've always had much better success with fetch and rebase than with pull and merge. I'm assuming it doesn't care.
Yeah, the question was that on the local side, users had more success with fetch and rebase instead of pull, and I forgot to mention that during the session, and I'm glad you brought that up. In my situation and most of the work that we do, we never use pull at all, unless you use pull with the rebase flag. Since I talk about it and train on it, I don't ever use that example of the pull with the rebase flag. But the reason for that is Andrew Riley explains it a lot in his Git seminar there as well. And there's some other talks online about the reasons for it as well. One of the main things is that pull is going to add a lot of extra history to your Git log. So each time you do a pull, it's basically merging things in. Where if you do a fetch and rebase, when you run git fetch, that's going to pull in all the changes that have been made, but not actually apply them to you yet. When you do a rebase, it's going to move your pointer in time to where all the remote stuff was at, and then apply the patches that you've made on top of that instead of trying to merge it all together. And what it allows you to do is it keeps the Git log history a little bit cleaner. So instead of having 2 commits of real commit, then a merge when you did a pull from origin, and then you got another 1 commit, another merge, another commit, another merge, all you have is just the actual code commits of things that have changed. Is there one on the other side?
I'm sure this is quite another topic, but this is all great for your actual files. Is there something that allows you to use Git with your database content?
For your database content, there is not individually. You can abstract that somewhat though, and within Drupal there's a lot of talks on features as a module you want to look at for that. And basically what it does is take individual pieces of Drupal, puts those into code, and then you can add those pieces of code to Git, roll those out to your server, and at that point features on the server is going to unpack them and say, hey, here's this view that's in code. Now it's over here on the staging environment for you. And that's the way you can take individual pieces like that. There's also things like a node export module that'll export nodes to code and then import them back on the database as well. That's used, I think, deploy module as well for that. Yeah. Anything else? And the other thing that also mentioned here as well is Git flow is not the only standard for doing this. It's one of the popular ones for branching and merging strategies, but there are other ones that have started evolving out there online as well for branching and merging, and different places have looked at different ones of them. I use this one, and we at Media use it just because it's the biggest one, and most people are using it and understand it. But there are other ones based on your needs that people have made that might add other functionality in as well. It's just different scripts. So in theory, you could actually take Git flow and make it clean up after itself on the remote server if that's your workflow. Or you can make things, you can adjust what those scripts are actually doing for you, or make your own system in general.
On that topic I was talking about earlier, there were some yellow dots in the sequence that didn't have any purple dots right into them.
Okay.
I'm confused why you would have commits on that develop branch, or maybe I misunderstood each one.
So let's go all the way back and let me try and, so the yellow dots that didn't have any arrows pointing to them is the question? Yeah, so the question was you shouldn't have any independent, it doesn't seem like you should have any independent yellow dots because all the work should be happening in features. In theory, that's true, but we don't, it's not horrible to commit to develop. You can commit directly to develop if you needed to. An instance of that might be a spelling change or some individual thing that's only going to take one commit to fix. It's a very safe change, it's not going to have a lot of problems to it or things like that that might have lots of different touch points. You could theoretically push that one commit directly onto the develop branch. It's not a horrible thing to do on Git flow, but your bigger changes and things like that should all be in the feature branches. Where you don't want to make commits is directly on master. You will make commits on the release branch because that's part of its concept for being there. And on the hotfix branch is definitely where you're going to make releases as well because that only lives for a very short period of time while you make those changes. Does that explain it?
will it still work if you choose not to have the exact number of branches? What if you want to have an extra branch, or maybe you don't want to use feature branches?
So the question was, will Git flow still work if you don't want to have those exact branches that they have? Well, in theory, yes, but in theory, no also. So you could not use some of them, I guess, but its commands are basing off of those individual pieces you set up. So when you did the Git flow init, in theory, you could rename those branches, but for instance, the release branch, when you do a Git flow release start, it's still going to go to whatever you name that as. If you wanted to actually add other parts of the workflow in there, is when you probably need to extend Git flow and add other macros for those other individual workflows you want to have at that point. You'd have to alter the code yourself to do that at that point. Yeah.
Is there any reason to keep feature branches after they've been merged, or should they is proper procedure to delete them once they're merged?
Proper procedures to delete them. The question was for the video here. Is there any reason to delete feature branches after they've been merged into develop, or to keep feature branches after they've been merged into develop? Well, Git flow will delete them automatically locally for you. So in theory, you don't really get a choice once you've done a finish on them. But there are workflows in terms where you can have a feature branch that might still need some more work, but it's at a stopping point for it, and you might merge that into develop individually. It's probably not a good idea, though. At that point, you probably want to finish the feature, so you have a logical stopping point of where that was merged into develop, and then start a new feature off of that at that point. And another thing you want to do that I didn't mention this, has come up a lot more through more and more use of this, and more and more teams using it, is that as you're working on feature branches, they shouldn't last very long in code. So a week, 2 weeks at max while you're doing the active development on it. But while you're doing active development, if there's other members of the team pushing things to develop all the time, you're going to want to fetch and rebase your develop and merge those into your feature branch so you get the most recent version of your develop code on your feature branch as well. And what that's going to allow you to do is when you get to the time where you're going to merge your release branch into develop, there's less chance of conflicts at that point, and there's less chance of things breaking at that point. You kind of have a better understanding of what's changed up on the upstream branches there into your feature branch.
The feature branches shouldn't get too far behind.
Right, you want to try and keep them in sync, and it's perfectly okay to, however often you want, merge develop into your feature branch. At that point, and that's a good thing, a good practice to do. And one of the things I do actually in just my workflow is I'll actually, prior to finishing a release, or a feature rather, is I'll merge develop in right before I do the finish. And what that allows me to do is avoid one of the questions we had here earlier, was avoid some of those conflicts while the process is happening. I can take care of the conflict if it comes up on that feature branch, finish it, and then I do the Git flow feature finish, and now I know there's not going to be a conflict when it merges back over. I think there's one more in the back, and we still have a minute or two.
Similar question to the yellow dots question. So what Git flow commands are you running on a series of green dots? You're saying Git flow release creates that first green dot, and then what commands create those second and third dots?
Okay, so the question was, what commands are creating those individual green dots that we're looking at here on the screen? And that's in the release branch. So basically you're doing, why did I lose? I hit the projector cable, there we go. So basically what we've got here is our Git flow release start is what's going to take that initial yellow dot and bring it to the first green dot. And what that's running at that point is actually a Git checkout of develop, then Git checkout -b of release / the release name that you made. So that's our first release. Those subsequent green dots that you have down here are actually can be individual commits that you're making directly to that release branch. And that's those fixes that you're making in order to roll this out to production. There shouldn't be new features. There should never be a new feature that you're adding. It should always just be a bug fix that you might find at that point. But that's where those subsequent green dots will come into play. And then when the release is finished at that point, you would merge back in. So in this case, they actually, in this situation, found, for the example they were given when you read through the full piece of this, is the second green dot that we have. It merges back down, you notice, but it doesn't merge over to the master. Their reasoning there was that we're looking just for bug fixes here. When we were doing our QA though, we realized that there was this new feature or this new problem that couldn't be fixed very quickly. So we merged that as a new feature all the way back down, and then we continued our release with just the bug fixes that we had.
So if you're starting from like completely scratch, you get a new project that's not going to go to production for like 6 months. Do you start up with anything in master, or? The question was, if you're starting a completely new project, nothing's going to be going out. I'm going to trip over this by coming out here a couple times. If you're starting a completely new project out and you've got nothing, nothing's going to production for a long time, what is in the master branch at that point? And the question is, the answer is really however you want to start. Usually what I do is I have the Drupal core and any contrib modules and the install profile that I want to use, all that stuff I start out with. And then from that point, I jump out to develop and go from there. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky too, is when you're doing that much active development, it's hard to keep, you have so many multiple feature branches going at that point. You have to do a lot of merging back, or a lot of features depend on other features and things like that. It gets a little bit tricky at that point for those types of things. So would you kind of set up all that stuff initially and then say, okay, now I'm going to start using GitFlow?
You do, yeah, you put as much in as your initial contrib and core stuff that isn't any custom code first in the master, then bring yourself out to develop. And you don't even have to do that necessarily just on the straight Git. You could initialize GitFlow first, put all that in develop, do a first release and say, hey, here's my core, and then go from there off from that point.
Is it pretty typical then that everything to the right of develop is for the gatekeeper?
Definitely. The question was, is it typical for everything to the right of develop to be for the gatekeeper, or what I like to call them as release managers a lot of times. And normally that's going to be your lead or your release manager, whoever is going to be running the release, is going to be the only one that's actually running those commands. Others could, obviously, but usually those steps also involve needing access to those staging servers, needing access to those production servers and things like that. And most people that are going to be doing the feature creation things aren't going to have access to all those sides as well. So normally it is going to be a release manager doing that.
If you're working on these features and the features track on remote platform, so your whole team's working on that same feature together, you still need to branch off and do your own development on your own local branch, right? On the feature, so that you're not committing on top of the feature branch and moving slow.
Right, so the question was that if everyone's working on a remote feature branch, you still want to be working locally so you're not committing out on that dev server at that point? Is that right?
Yeah, what I normally do is work on my local branch, and if one of the team members pushes to remote, I pull down their change and rebase.
Yeah.
On top of that, and I usually don't merge my changes in until I'm ready for it to go over to the remote.
So the question was, yeah, another developer is making changes, you're working on your local, you pull in their change or rebase their changes into yours, and you're not necessarily pushing yours back up until you're ready for them to be. And that's a perfectly fine situation to do at that point.
That usually lets it fast forward. That feature for branch will always be fast forward and not branching out and remerging. So
Right. The only problem that could come into play when you're doing that sort of workflow, though, is that those other developers that are working that feature branch also, your code might be affecting them in some way also. And if you're not pushing it up to origin very often, then they might be missing out and their code might be broken. And the longer that diverges, the harder it's going to be to track down where that problem is.
we've tried to keep a policy of making sure that we're pushing up as often as we can. So usually no more than 24 hours you can go without pushing.
Yeah, it's definitely good to always make sure to push up as often as you can, because it's also a good backup for you as well, since everything's on your local machine, to have that up on a remote as a backup if something happens to your machine in the meantime. The other thing to remember too is that you can also go a little bit inception here and have a feature of a feature. And go, so if you have that one big remote feature, this could be one of the workflows we were talking about a little bit earlier over here, is that you could have a feature that's your main feature of something, but all these different developers work on a different part of that. Theoretically, those could be individual features of that feature, and you can merge from there. The Git flow might not work perfectly for that, but you can do the same merge commands that it would do to integrate that workflow. We'll do one more question if there are any, otherwise we'll wrap up. For a few minutes over now. Nothing else? All right, well, thank you very much. Let me know, DCATL